The dining room at the Whitmore estate was the kind of room built to intimidate. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across a table long enough to seat 16. And every place setting gleamed like it had something to prove. At the head of that table sat Gerald Whitmore, a man who had spent 40 years building a reputation as Chicago's most ruthless developer, and who now spent his evenings reminding everyone at his table exactly how far beneath him they were. I had learned, over 6 years of marriage to his son, that silence was the only armor that worked against him. That night, silence wasn't enough. "You're worthless trash," Gerald said, setting down his wine glass with theatrical precision. "My son could have married a Whitfield or a Callahan. Instead he brought home a nobody who can't even hold a real job." The table went still. Every fork froze midair. Before you see what she does next, if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, hidden success, and satisfying endings where justice finally arrives, hit subscribe now, because this is one you won't want to miss. 18 relatives, cousins, aunts, business partners invited to what was supposed to be a quiet anniversary dinner, all turned to look at me. My husband, Daniel, opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His mother, Margaret, stared hard at her plate, the way she always did when Gerald decided someone needed to be put in their place. My name is Claire Bennett Whitmore, and for 6 years, I had let this family believe I was exactly what Gerald said I was. A woman with an unremarkable finance job who happened to be lucky enough to marry into money. It had started small. In the first year of my marriage, when Gerald introduced me at a Christmas party as Daniel's little accountant friend. And I hadn't corrected him, because it was easier than explaining myself to a man who had already decided who I was. Over time, the small omissions became a habit, and the habit became a wall I built brick by brick, mostly because I liked watching him underestimate me, and partly because I had learned, growing up in a house where my own father dismissed every ambition I ever voiced, that some people only respect what they can't ignore. I never imagined the wall would come down over a dinner table on a Tuesday in November, in front of people who had known me for years and still chose silence over decency. I set my fork down carefully, folded my napkin, and looked directly at him. "You're absolutely right, Gerald," I said, my voice even. "I am trash. Worthless trash." Gasps rippled around the table. Even Gerald blinked, thrown by the lack of a fight. I rose, smoothed my dress, and reached for my purse. Daniel finally found his voice. "Claire, wait," Dad didn't mean. But I was already walking toward the door, past the marble entryway Gerald loved to brag about, past the portraits of himself he'd commissioned for the stairwell. What none of them knew, what not one person in that house understood, was that I had personally financed the mortgage on this very estate through a shell arrangement 3 years earlier, when Gerald's company had been 2 months from default and too proud to admit it. He had spent years telling strangers at galas about his brilliant, mysterious backer, never once imagining that the woman funding his empire was the same daughter-in-law he humiliated over dessert. Outside, the November air was sharp and clean. I pulled out my phone before I'd even reached my car, and something in my chest that had been simmering for years finally went cold and still. I scrolled to a name I hadn't called in months. "Marcus," I said when my lawyer picked up. "It's Claire. I need withdrawal notices drafted for every entity tied to Whitmore Development. All of them. I want them ready to send by morning." There was a pause. "Claire, that's not a small position. You're talking about pulling the collateral behind the Lakeshore Tower project." "I'm aware," I said, sliding into the driver's seat. Through the window, I could see Gerald still holding court, gesturing wildly, no doubt explaining to the table why I deserved what I'd gotten. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. That very evening, before the insult, Gerald had spent 20 minutes bragging about a $200 million mixed-use tower set to break ground in the spring, funded, he said, by the smartest investor I've ever worked with. He had no idea he was describing his own daughter-in-law, the woman he'd just called trash in front of his entire family. "Time to show him," I whispered, starting the engine. "Exactly what trash is worth." The next morning came in gray and quiet, rain tapping steadily against the windows of my home office. I was at my desk by 6, laptop open, coffee going cold beside a stack of documents Marcus had emailed overnight. The withdrawal notices were ready. All they needed was my signature. My phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. Asterisk, I'm so sorry about last night. Dad was completely out of line. Can we talk tonight? Asterisk. I stared at the screen for a long time. Daniel was a good man, caught permanently between loyalty to his father and love for me. But there are some lines that can't be walked back once they're crossed. I typed back only, asterisk, at work early. We'll talk tonight. Asterisk. Daniel believed I worked as a mid-level analyst at a boutique firm downtown, quietly building spreadsheets for other people's ambitions. He had no idea his wife was the founder and sole owner of Alden Capital Partners, an investment firm I had built from nothing during the years everyone assumed I was simply figuring myself out. He didn't know I had been the anonymous force behind 3 of his father's last 4 developments. He didn't know that the man who called me trash had been standing, unknowingly, on a foundation made of my money for 18 months. I opened the Whitmore file and let the numbers settle in front of me. Gerald's company was leveraged to the edge of collapse, every property cross-collateralized against the Lakeshore Tower deal. Without my continued backing, the whole structure would come down like a house built on sand. I thought about every dinner where he'd sneered at me for not doing real work, every holiday where he'd made some pointed comment about Daniel marrying down. The picture in front of me was almost beautiful in its symmetry. At 9:30, I called Marcus back. Send them, I said. All of them. And time it. I want Gerald to receive 3 messages at exactly 10 o'clock. First, his lawyer gets the formal withdrawal. Second, Daniel gets a message explaining that I am the investor his father has been praising for a year. Third, Gerald gets a text from me directly. What do you want it to say? Marcus asked. I looked out at the rain. Tell him. Don't insult the trash that's holding up your house. There was a pause on the line. Claire, this is going to destroy him. I thought of Gerald's voice booming across that table, of 18 relatives who looked away instead of defending me, of Daniel frozen in his chair while his father tore me apart in public. Yes, I said quietly. Send them. At 10:07, my phone rang. It was Daniel, and his voice was frantic. Claire, I just got a message that makes no sense. Trash, I finished for him. In front of everyone. While standing on my money. He didn't have time to respond before his father's name lit up my screen. An incoming call I let go straight to voicemail. Within the hour, my inbox was flooded. First from Gerald's attorney, then from 3 separate contractors, then from Gerald himself, every message more desperate than the last. By noon, Gerald was standing in my office doorway, his face red, his silver hair disheveled, Daniel trailing behind him looking ashamed. This is impossible, Gerald said, his voice shaking with a fury I'd never seen turned on anyone but me. You can't be behind Alden Capital. That's a real firm. Please sit, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. Or should I call you Mr. Whitmore, since this is business now? He didn't sit. You're a housewife, he spat. You don't have that kind of money. I turned my laptop toward him, pulling up my firm's investor profile. Claire Bennett, founder and CEO of Alden Capital Partners. I've managed over $80 million in assets since I left Wharton. I watched the color drain from his face as the screen loaded. The filings, the licenses, the audited statements. Every permit, every contractor, every piece of steel that went into your last 3 buildings, that came from me. Daniel stepped forward, his voice quiet. Dad, it's true. Everything you've built this past year, you built on Claire's money. Gerald sank into the chair he'd refused to take a moment earlier. You never said anything, he said. You just sat there while you lectured me about not doing real work, I said. While you called me trash in front of your entire family. I sat there financing your life. His phone buzzed violently on the desk between us. I nodded toward it. That's probably your contractors. They've already received their notices. Gerald's hands trembled as he reached for the phone, staring at the screen like it belonged to someone else's life. This is a mistake, he muttered, more to himself than to me. There has to be a way to fix this. I have relationships. I have 30 years in this industry. People know me. People know you as the man who built 3 towers on my money and called me trash for not having real work, I said. That's the relationship you have now. Daniel, still standing near the door, finally spoke again. his voice low and pained. Dad, when you said those things at dinner, did you ever once consider that Claire might not just walk away quietly? You've spent 30 years telling people never to threaten a deal without a plan for what comes after. You didn't have a plan for this. Gerald turned to his son as if seeing him clearly for the first time in years. You knew, he said. You knew who she was and you let me. I didn't know, Daniel said. Not until this morning. But even if I had known, Dad, nothing excuses what you said to her. Nothing. For the next several hours, Gerald's world came apart in real time. He paced my office, barking into his phone, demanding explanations that no longer existed. Contracts unraveled. His attorney called mine, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. Every agreement I'd signed included a standard withdrawal clause, executed entirely within the bounds of the law. You planned this, Gerald hissed at one point, his composure finally cracking. No, I said. I decided at 10:07 last night. The moment you called me worthless trash. By late afternoon, his primary lender had called in the loans tied to Lakeshore Tower. Without my collateral behind the project, the bank had no choice. Gerald's face went the color of old paper when he hung up the phone. 60 days, he said numbly. They're giving me 60 days. Then your empire falls in 60 days, I said, and for the first time in 6 years, my voice held no fear of him at all. He begged briefly, the way proud men do when the ground gives out beneath them, all at once and without dignity. I'll apologize, he said. I'll make it right. You'll apologize because you've lost money, I told him, standing to walk him to the door. Not because you respect me. Those aren't the same thing. He paused at the threshold, looking back at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not arrogance, but something closer to fear. What am I supposed to tell people? He asked quietly. How do I explain any of this? Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them you called your daughter-in-law worthless trash at your own dinner table, and it turned out she was the only reason your empire was still standing. People will understand the rest on their own. He didn't say anything else. He simply turned and walked out, and I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway until the office was quiet again, quieter than it had been in 18 months. 2 weeks later, I sat in my favorite cafe downtown, reading a headline in the business section. Prominent developer files for bankruptcy after anonymous investor withdraws support. The article traced in careful detail how a company once considered untouchable had collapsed in under a month. Daniel slid into the seat across from me, looking exhausted in a way I hadn't seen since our wedding. It's official, he said. Dad lost the office, the properties, even the lake house. I stirred my coffee. How is he handling it? Badly, Daniel admitted. He still thinks it's a misunderstanding. He asked me to convince you to meet with him. He thinks the family needs you. I nearly laughed. The family needs me. After 18 people watched him call me trash and said nothing. Daniel rubbed his temples. He doesn't see you as the investor, Claire. In his mind, you're still just my wife who happens to run some company that invested in him. He can't accept that you made those decisions yourself. Word of Gerald's collapse moved quickly through Chicago's business circles. At networking events, his name became a cautionary tale. The man who insulted his own silent partner and lost everything because of it. Investors who had once courted him now quietly kept their distance, unwilling to be associated with someone who couldn't recognize the person funding his own success. The humiliation, everyone agreed, was worse than the bankruptcy itself. A month after the bankruptcy filing, I received a handwritten letter from Gerald, delivered to my office instead of my home, as if even in defeat he understood that the office was where the real power now lived. It was 3 paragraphs long, stiff and formal, the kind of apology written by a man more concerned with rebuilding his reputation than reckoning with what he'd done. He asked, almost in passing, whether Alden Capital might consider revisiting its position on future projects, once things had settled. I read it twice, then set it aside without responding. Some letters don't deserve an answer. They deserve to be understood for what they are, which in this case was a business proposal wearing the mask of regret. 6 months later, I attended a cousin's wedding on Daniel's side of the family. Gerald wasn't there. His wife, Margaret, found me near the reception, her eyes glassy. Claire, I want to apologize, she said. Gerald was cruel that night, and we all know it now. We also know how long you carried this family without saying a word. I studied her for a moment before answering. I accept your apology, Margaret. But some things can't be undone. She nodded, her shoulders dropping. And I understood then that whatever ties had bound this family together had been scorched past repair. Later that evening, one of Daniel's cousins pulled me aside near the bar, half drunk on champagne and honesty, and admitted that she had always known Gerald was cruel to me, and had always told herself it wasn't her place to say anything. None of us said anything, she said. That's the part one can't forgive myself for. I told her I understood because I did. It is easier to explain away someone else's cruelty than to risk becoming its next target. But understanding it didn't make it hurt any less, and it didn't make me trust the family any more than I already did, which by then was not very much at all. Meanwhile, my firm grew stronger than it had ever been. Developers who once hesitated to work with a woman running her own capital firm now sought me out directly, impressed by the discipline of my exit from a partnership that had turned toxic. I never had to spread the story myself. Gerald had done that for me, the moment he decided to underestimate me at his own dinner table. Respect, I learned, doesn't arrive because you demand it. It arrives quietly once people understand you never needed their approval to begin with. I had spent years chasing a version of belonging that required me to shrink, to explain myself, to prove I deserved a seat at a table I had, without anyone realizing it, been paying to keep standing. I stopped chasing that version of belonging the night Gerald handed me, without meaning to, the clearest gift he ever gave me. Permission to stop pretending. Gerald, on the other hand, spiraled. His properties were gone within the year. Old business partners distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a man who had mocked his own financial backer in public. Even his marriage buckled under the weight of it. Margaret could no longer bear the humiliation, or the financial ruin that followed him everywhere he went. His attempts to rebuild were met with quiet laughter behind closed doors. How do you not recognize your own daughter-in-law as your investor? People whispered at industry dinners. If you can't respect the person funding you, how can anyone trust you with their money? Eventually, the man who had once boasted about his vision took a junior position at another developer's firm, a shadow of the mogul he used to be. Chicago no longer saw him as untouchable. He had become a warning. One spring morning, I stood on the balcony of my new office tower, overlooking a construction site my firm had financed from the ground up. Below, workers moved steadily around a foundation that would, for once, rise because of a partnership built on mutual respect rather than quiet resentment. Daniel joined me, wrapping an arm around my waist. You changed everything, he said softly. No, I said, watching the skyline. Your father changed everything, the moment he decided I was worthless. I just stopped pretending my value was invisible. He kissed my forehead gently. I wish he'd seen what you were really worth before all of this. He did see it, Daniel, I said. He just couldn't accept it. Pride blinded him long before I ever picked up that phone. That evening, alone in my home office, I reviewed contracts for the next project. New language, new partnerships, the quiet architecture of things being built the right way this time. I paused, catching my reflection in the dark window glass, and thought back to that dinner table, the chandelier light, the silence of 18 relatives who looked away instead of standing beside me. I remembered the fire that had ignited in me that night, and the strange, clean satisfaction of watching an empire fall not from bad luck, but from its own arrogance. Sometimes, I murmured to the empty room, walking away is the loudest answer of all. Word of Gerald's downfall lingered in Chicago's business circles for years afterward, a story people told at industry dinners as a warning about pride and blindness.